the talk. Here it is. So welcome, everyone. We are very happy to have you all here today for this session of the webinar in philosophy of psychiatry. I'm going to introduce our speakers. So Kathryn, Tabb, and Lara Keuck. I should have asked you if I pronounced that well, actually. Lara?
Yeah, it's all fine. It's Lara Keuck.
Lara Keuck. Okay, thank you. So Kathryn Tabb is an assistant professor of philosophy at Bard College. She works in history and philosophy of psychiatry at the intersection of history of philosophy and history of mind and medicine. And she's interested in the connections drawn between personhood and irrationality by British empiricist psychologists and philosophers of mind during the modern period, focusing especially on John Locke. She also works on contemporary epistemological and ethical issues surrounding the classification and diagnosis of disease, and has interests in applied medical ethics and experimental philosophy. She works in the ethical, political, and cultural implications of the way mental illness is researched and treated. And among others, she's the author of Madness as Methods on Locke's thought experiments about personal identity, published in 2018, and Philosophy of Psychiatry After Diagnostic Kinds on Synthèse 2018. And Lara Keuck is a researcher in history and philosophy of medicine at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, where she leads an independent Max Planck research group on practices of validation in the biomedical sciences. She works in medicine, philosophy, and history, and her research also focuses on meta-methodological questions and on the uses of history and philosophy of biomedicine. She's one of the editors of Vagueness in Psychiatry, International Perspectives in Philosophy and Psychiatry, published in 2017 at Oxford University Press. And today, both of them are going to talk together about scoping psychiatry. So without further ado, Kathryn Tabb and Lara Keuck.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Marie. I've been a great admirer of this series. Unfortunately, from afar, I keep teaching during the time of these talks, and it's been very painful to miss them, but it's just been a wonderful lineup. And I really want to thank everyone for coming. I feel so deprived of friends and colleagues that even seeing your names in these little black boxes is really filling my heart. So yeah, this is joint work. Lara and I have been thinking and working together for, I don't know, like a decade about various things. And this is our first attempt to really make a mashup of our two current research programs. And we're really excited to get your feedback on it. I think we're at this point ready to actually write this paper and get it out the door. So we're particularly interested in any criticisms and feedback you have. Okay, let me get our slides up. All right. So I want to start by revisiting some history. I think probably for everyone here, it's fairly familiar. So I'll move quickly and we can go back to anything in the Q&A. But what I want to do is set up the problem that Lara and I are trying to address by introducing a new sort of validity. And this is Lara's brainchild of scope validity that we think addresses some problems, epistemic, but also I'm going to argue importantly ethical, that have been outstanding. And they've been outstanding for a while, but they've been particularly troubling since the rise of what I'm going to call precision psychiatry. So I just want to talk for a bit about what we mean by that. So as I think all of you will know, the DSM has gone through various methodological shifts over the course of its development, moving from its psychoanalytic history through an operationalist phase and then into a period of focus on causal explanation, though the form that is taken has changed over recent permutations of the DSM. But what's really important for our purposes is that the DSM started carrying just a lot of weight from the expectations on it to perform a variety of different kinds of tasks. So this is a quote from the introduction to the DSM-4 TR, published in 2000. Our highest priority has been to provide a helpful guide to clinical practice. We hope to make DSM-4 practical and useful for clinicians by striving for brevity of criteria sets, clarity of language, and explicit statements of the constructs embodied in diagnostic criteria. An additional goal was to facilitate research and improve communication among clinicians and researchers. We were also mindful of the use of the DSM-4 for improving the collection of clinical information and as an educational tool for teaching psychopathology, right? So this one book is supposed to be helping with clinical practice. It's supposed to be guiding research. It's supposed to be a teaching document. It's a lot. And for our purposes, we're interested in the history of its use in the research setting. So this is just a little factoid I got a while ago from Bruce Cuthbert, who just did kind of an informal study of journals in 2012, looking at how DSM categories were used in these journals. And he found that over 90% of articles in the top 3 research journals, so that's American Journal of Psychiatry, Biological Psychiatry, and JAMA, examined a single DSM disorder, comparing patients diagnosed with the condition to healthy controls. So the DSM, up until the first decades of the 21st century, was really operating as the kind of organizing principle for psychiatric research. So because of this, of course, we all have been very preoccupied with this question of what these categories are. Are they natural kinds? Are they constructed kinds? Are they practical kinds? And I, in earlier work, got concerned that maybe we were kind of missing a boat that had left for most psychiatrists, which was that they were starting to wonder if these were actually the most useful kinds at all, and if these particular kinds, these diagnostic kinds, were kind of taking up more oxygen than they should in psychiatric reasoning because they were starting to fail to do their jobs. And I think this is in part because the search for essences for these categories had just fallen short. And this is, of course, what has caused philosophers of psychiatry to generally conclude that these are not natural kinds or not real kinds. So it's just a quote, I won't read it, but a quote from Ken Kendler, recognizing the painful lessons that psychiatric geneticists started to learn in the 90s and in the early 2000s as any hope for any underlying genetic essence for any of our psychiatric categories just fell away. And not to say that there haven't been findings of candidate genes that are implicated in psychiatric disorders, but they're genes of very, very small effect. Similarly, the hope that neural circuits could act as some essence undergirding our psychiatric categories also fell away. This is a quote from the psychologist Ben Leahy and his co-author Zald, and this is in an application to the NIMH for research funding. Categorical mental disorders do not line up one-to-one with variations in the functioning of neural circuits. Rather, neural circuits align with narrow neurobehavioral constructs that are themselves related to psychopathology in a cross-cutting fashion. Dysfunction in each construct is related to multiple forms of psychopathology, and most forms of psychopathology are related to dysfunction in more than one construct. This worry that the diagnostic categories would just be too heterogeneous for relevant biological mechanisms to show themselves when DSM categories are used to select research samples in the lab, became a real preoccupation for some of the leaders of the National Institutes of Mental Health in the United States at about this time. So here's a quote from Steve Hyman, who was directing the NIMH in the early years of the 21st century. Given the status of the DSM-4 criteria as community consensus, the FDA held that it could not by itself recognize the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia as an indication for the development and approval of new treatments. So the worry here is that because the category of schizophrenia as defined by the DSM doesn't recognize certain kinds of symptoms, that is, the patients who would receive this diagnosis and thus be used as the test population for investigating the mechanisms of schizophrenia will not display certain kinds of symptoms, funding research into those symptoms becomes really hard. So Hyman has written that because of this, the DSM has become an epistemic prison. Sometimes it talks about an epistemic bottleneck that really puts a limit on the kind of research that psychiatrists can do. In its next manifestation under Thomas Insel, the NIMH became very explicitly critical of the DSM. Insel published this article in 2005 with Remy Corillon, where he describes psychiatry as a clinical neuroscience discipline. So the idea is to move away from the phenomenology that had characterized psychiatric nosology in the era of the DSM, and really free clinical neuroscience to start reshaping our thinking about diagnostic categories. And I think, as most of you know at this point, certainly if you've heard me talk in the past few years, and a few of you have done your own really important work on this, the National Institute of Mental Health developed its own instrument for classifying psychiatric research. So this is not a taxonomic instrument for classifying patients. This is a way to think about psychiatric research that doesn't rely on those DSM categories. So the idea is, if you don't require researchers to think in terms of DSM categories, you free them to investigate in more promising ways biological mechanisms. So RDoC is a matrix, is the small part of it, but you can see that it has as its columns units of analysis going from genes all the way up to self-report. And then it has these constructs that are drawn from cognitive science and neuroscience. And what the researcher does is they identify their research in one of these cells. So instead of saying, I work on auditory hallucination in schizophrenia, I would say I work on auditory perception at the level of the neural circuit. And I wouldn't refer to the category of pathology at all. Okay, so all of this, which again, I think is probably relatively familiar to people, got folded in under the umbrella of what Insel started calling precision psychiatry, and more people in the United States started calling precision psychiatry or precision medicine for psychiatry. And this value of precision, Lara and I are going to argue, is a promissory value. It's an aspirational value. We think it is something that has not been either quantified nor qualified to the extent that it would need to be to justify its current motivational power in psychiatry. So that's kind of where we're going with this. But I wanted to make sure to situate recent developments in contemporary psychiatry in this larger movement of precision medicine, which I'll now talk about for a minute. I think some of you in Europe and also in Canada might be more familiar with the language of personalized medicine that was also used in the United States up until about 2010. The National Research Council released in that year this volume entitled Towards Precision Medicine that was done at the request of then President Obama to kind of theorize this movement. And basically, so our National Academies of Sciences define precision medicine. Its goal is to ensure that the right treatment is delivered to the right patient at the right time. What this has meant in practice is a real focus on biomarkers, such as genetic markers, but also protein blood markers, various kinds of markers that correlate with syndrome presentation and also correlate with certain outcomes of pharmacological intervention or other forms of intervention. So the idea is, instead of, and anyone who works with psychiatric patients is very familiar with this picture, right? Patients come in with the same general symptom profile, they all get the same medication, it works for some, it doesn't work for others, some have bad side effects. So the idea is that by using this biomarker, one can calibrate better the kind of medication that will benefit each patient, resulting in a tailored therapy. There's an enormous amount of investment in precision medicine in the United States. This is the old website for the Precision Medicine Initiative that was introduced under Obama. I just want to pause for a second to think about this language of precision. So this was popular language in the first decade of the 21st century in a few different contexts. One of them was warfare. And I think the idea is very similar with precision medicine, that you have a clean target that you can focus on. You're not taking out an area, you're taking out a biological mechanism. You can kind of get in, you can get out, and you have good intel to make sure that you are hitting the right target. The kind of poster child for precision medicine has been Herceptin, which is an anti-cancer drug. And Herceptin only works for tumors that are overexpressing a certain gene. If you have that sort of tumor, it is quite effective, more effective than other therapies. If you don't, it's not. And one important thing to note for our purposes also about Herceptin is that it has really changed the topography of classification in oncology, so that tumors that respond to Herceptin are now grouped together, so that there's been a shift away of thinking about tumors in terms of location to thinking about them in terms of their response to various forms of therapy. Precision medicine has really required a huge amount of information. It requires massive, massive data sets. So in this case on the left, this is an article from the New Yorker a while ago about the research of David Goldstein at Columbia, and this is a kind of classic success story of precision medicine. This little boy who had a genetic anomaly that once identified had a very easy dietary fix. So he was dying, and then once the genetic anomaly was realized, it was very easy to address, but it wouldn't have been possible without the identification of this genetic anomaly, which took huge, huge amounts of like population level data. On the right, this is a direct-to-consumer advertisement for precision medicine. And this is because these companies need our data in order to find these biomarkers and then find treatment. So there's been critics of precision medicine, mostly coming from public health. I'll read a quote by Ron Fair and Galea, is a social worker at Columbia. Research undertaken in the name of precision medicine may well open new vistas of science, and precision medicine itself may ultimately make critical contributions to a narrow set of conditions that are primarily genetically determined. But the challenge we face to improve population health does not involve the frontiers of science and molecular biology. It entails development of the vision and willingness to address certain persistent social realities, and it requires an unstinting focus on the factors that matter most to the production of population health. So Bayer is really at an extreme. He's someone who thinks precision medicine is basically like a massive Ponzi scheme, that what it's doing is gathering a huge amount of scientific information, all of which is irrelevant to the basic determinants of public health, most of which are not mysterious, right? They're not sexy. It's like, we need the air to be better. We need nutrition to be better in other parts of the world. We need like mosquito nets. So for him, it's all kind of like a big, smoke and mirrors show that's distracting from the fact that we're not funding basic healthcare. People have not gone to that sort of extreme, but still expressed anxiety about the focus on precision medicine over other forms of health and medical research. This is just a recent article where this author is opining on this vis-a-vis COVID-19 and talking about how the rush to start like sequencing the virus, thinking about the virus in terms of its biomarkers may have distracted us from what they see as more fundamental questions about prevention. Okay, so I just want to pose what Lara and I see as kind of the interesting philosophical challenge to precision medicine here, which is just, based on that kind of critique, but trying to formalize it a little bit. And the worry is what I in my work have called a worry about diachronic justice. So this is the distribution of research dollars over time. And this again goes back to the worry that precision medicine is in some way a real promissory note, that it is a research program that hopes to pay off somewhere down the line. So this is a graph from an article entitled Charting a Course for Genomic Medicine from base pairs to bedside. This came out in Nature in 2011. And you can see here, like, this is the vision, right? So this article is being written in 2011, which is in here, which is this period of growth from understanding the structure of genomes, understanding the biology of genomes, to understanding the biology of disease. And the hope is that, and that's about scientific discovery, right? Like, none of this has anything to do with patients, that is, with the treating of disease. This is about, maybe we want to say, translational research to think about the causes of disease, probably using animal models. And the vision here was that in the following decade, precision medicine would move on to advancing the science of medicine, such that beyond 2020, we would be in this column of improving effective healthcare. Right. Similarly, this is a diagram from a 2015 article by Thomas Insel, 2010 article by Insel, where you see a really similar kind of vision, that by 2015, there would be this kind of transition from the decade of discovery to the decade of translation, and personal care would really kick off starting around then. And there would be this kind of increase in the use of these various technologies that would lead to prevention, cures, and dissemination by 2025. So obviously, you know, we've fallen far short of the ambitions of these authors. And so the question that we want to pose is how we know when investment in basic science research and a move away from psychopathology, and, you know, there's many reasons to criticize the DSM, and Lara and I are in no way kind of, you know, wanting to go back to the land and live off the DSM, but there has been this real turn away from psychopathology and away from the clinical picture and towards basic science research. So the question is, when is it worth it, right? When do we know that the payoff for transformations in the clinic will come from this kind of basic science research? This matters because it is a zero-sum game, at least in the United States. So the National Institute of Mental Health is really the one source for funding for psychiatric research. For research into treatment, we have other, like SAMHSA and other institutes, but in terms of research into psychiatric disorder itself, the NIMH is really the source of public funding that we have. Since Insel's strategic plan was implemented, the NIMH's spending on basic science has gone up by 28%, while the budget for research into epidemiology, treatment, and health services has gone down by 16.7%. So right now, the budget is at about 50-50 between basic science research and clinical research, and translational research sometimes falls on one side or sometimes on the other. So this is a real shift in the way that we're thinking about investing our money in psychiatry. Okay, I'm now going to hand it over to Lara, and she's going to talk to you a bit about how this problem plays itself out in psychiatric research, and how we think that our new form of validity can address the kind of specification of the promise of precision psychiatry. So, Lara.
Yeah, thank you also, everyone, for having us here. And thank you, Katie, for opening up the field. Yeah, so when thinking about, like, how can we assess whether this is more than just a promise, right? Our take is not to say that we have the answer or that we want, like, a specific, to put forward a specific measure, but rather to make more transparent what kind of questions we can pose, and what kind of scientific methods might be interesting to look at, and what kind of, like, ethical questions are also involved with that. So to this end, we want to propose a specific concept of validity, and this concept of validity that we call scope validity has some similarities to other concepts of validity, and also some differences, and that's what I will now be talking about. So if you think about validity, then mostly the question that is discussed with respect to this question of the translation from the basic science to clinical applications is termed as a problem of extrapolation. So how do you get from internal validity to external validity? And so internal validity would then be that you know that is like you have establish a certain model, for instance, in a laboratory, and then external validity is that it also works in other settings. Next. Sorry, yeah. So this whole question of how validity has become an issue of concern since the 1950s in psychiatric research, and how people have thought about what validity is and how to translate it is something that I'm looking at together with Steve Demaseux, and we're bringing together like very different kinds of voices. Ken Schaffner, who's also in the audience, has also presented in our seminar series. And if you like to know more about validity in psychiatric research and want to attend more talks like these, then you're cordially invited to join our seminar series. So this is just like a short advertisement block, but I also want to take that to just phrase the point that we have to kind of like question both what is validity and also what does translation mean. Next. Yeah, so to this end, when we think about translating validity in psychiatric research, Steve and I have distinguished 3 different kinds of challenges that we call the lexical challenge. So this is about translation literally, the experimental challenge, how you get certain, like from a concept or category to a protocol, and the extrapolation challenge. And this is what like we want to address here with the scope validity. Next. Okay, so translation, the term that like has been applied to like this, what is sometimes called the pipeline model that you see here in the image. It has first also been applied to cancer research in the beginning of the 1990s. So that's where the term like translational medicine has first been applied. And then in the last decades, it has kind of like been more and more applied to different areas, including psychiatry. So here really kind of like the question is, how do you come from this basic science discovery to public health impact? And Miriam Salomon, who's also in the audience, has written a whole book also about like this problem. And yeah, so there's like a lot of there are a lot of different steps, and there's a lot of criticism also about this linear model of translation. And this is something that we also want to look at. Next. Okay, so one philosopher who's probably best known for targeting this problem of like, how do you come from like internal validity to external validity is Nancy Cartwright. Who has talked about this as like, how do we know that it works for us, right? So the idea here is, well, if you know that you've established a certain causal relationship in a given context, where can you extrapolate it to, and what kind of work do you need to actually make that work? Next. So here kind of like, she refers to a lot of people who have worked on extrapolation, refer to social scientists who have distinguished different kinds of validity, including this difference between internal validity and external validity. But also Keuck and Campbell themselves argue, next, that actually yeah, just one back, maybe, sorry. That actually in all different kinds of validity that you can kind of distinguish, and they're like, in the meanwhile have been many more. So there's like a whole, yeah, a large plethora of different subtypes of validity that have been distinguished, and that are also kind of operationalized in a bit of different ways in different settings. But even Keuck and Campbell said that like, if it's about causes, then in some way it's always also about this idea of construct validity. So this brings us to the question, what is construct validity? Next. And one basic definition could be that construct validity means it kind of like describes the relationship between a test or a model and the abstract hypothetical entity, so the so-called construct it aims to be informative of. Next. So this is a contemporary representation. by Danny Borsboom. And it's about how you can like think about this construct. So the construct would be the attribute that is assessed. So for instance, intelligence. So that's what you want to get at if you test something. And then the test score would be the attribute as assessed by the test. And then you also have the construct label, so the verbal label for the attribute. And so the question is here, what is the relationship between the construct and the test? Next. Ken Schaffner says that constructs are like, it can generally be understood as concepts that refer to entities that are general, abstract, and putatively explanatory. So that would be intelligence, working memory, oscillation circuits, abnormal personality types, but also disorders such as schizophrenia. And Borsboom and Marcus say it's a property tested or intended for testing, which assumes a substantive interpretation of this property. So also, it's also connected to this idea of a latent variable. Next. And so this is relevant in medicine because it's kind of like, so this idea has mostly been kind of like developed in psychometrics, but it then also has been applied to psychiatry, especially regarding animal models of human disorders. And it's relevant because it kind of like works with this idea that what you want to hit is an abstract entity, that there is something out there, the construct that your test or your model needs to represent in the right way. And this is kind of like a textbook introduction of like how often the difference between validity and reliability is represented. So the idea is, again, the kind of like a target, as we Katie has already pointed to the alignment with warfare metaphors. Next. But there's another idea of that is also underlying this idea of construct validity that has been like moved a bit in the background in the historical accounts of validity, where the focus has been very much on like, okay, what is the construct and how do you get to these different kinds of validity? But originally, a lot of these validity terminology were introduced as conceptual tools, not to kind of like measure something, but actually to signal doubt and then to guide strategic research decision. And this is something that I want to kind of like point the attention to. Next. So this goes back to this very famous article by Kronmark and Mehl, where they introduced the notion of construct validity in 1955, and there they really kind of like introduced it as an innovation for researchers who do not really know what they actually are measuring. Next. So they say that it's not just about the investigative procedures, but by the orientation of the investigator. And they contrast construct validity to criterion-oriented validity, because they say if you have a criterion-oriented validity, so then you already need to accept that there's a set of operations that are an adequate definition of whatever is to be measured. So like the DSM diagnostic categories in a way. But if you believe that no criterion available is actually fully valid, then you kind of like become very frustrated, and then you need some way to actually say, what are you frustrated about? And that's why they kind of like introduce this idea of construct validity, so that you say, well, okay, we have an intelligence test, but if we're like, the question that is at stake is, what about the construct of intelligence that we measure here? Next. Yeah, and so then they kind of like put all this in a very like Popperian framework. So they kind of like say, well, what we can do then is to come at certain strategic decisions that can kind of like guide our methodology. Next. Okay, so what I want to kind of like suggest is that when thinking about like this problem of precision psychiatry, maybe we have to think on the one hand differently about the role of the construct, that if you're not anymore so much interested in these abstract disease entities, then the question is, where does the construct come? But on the other hand, I think these we have also seen that it's very important to kind of have some framework at hand to question the relationship between this promises of precision psychiatry and the what actually the models are informative of. Next. Okay, so this brings us back to the problem of extrapolation and the question of models and clinical applications. Next. And here I want to present a case study. What you see here is a mouse, and it's an animal model. It's called chronic mild stress mouse model. And it has been said to have a high external validity, but only for a very small part of the total patient population with the clinical diagnosis of depressive disorder. Next. So when a drug that was successfully tested in this mouse model did not work in the clinical trial, then like one explanation was that the drug did not work because the scope of the animal model in which it worked was not broad enough to allow for extrapolation of the results to the clinical population. Next. But the explanation could also be reframed, and actually one of the animal scientists who works with this mouse models did argue so, and said that the clinical trials failed to actually detect effects that they might have had also in the clinical population. So the clinical trial population had the wrong scope, right? So you can either say the animal model had the wrong scope or the clinical trial population, because it was not stratified in the right way to allow for testing whether the drug that worked in the mouse model works for a subset of patients. Next. Okay, so I think what you see here is in a way a doubling of the problem. So you still have that problem of the construct validity. So what is kind of like the target? But it's not just that you can say, well, one is right and one is wrong, but it's actually a question of how good the targets match. Next. So I would like to suggest that we have to kind of like, this kind of like implies that you move from the question, how close is the hit? So what is the target? What is the right dart for the target, to how good the fit is between these different operationalizations of disease categories, or also kind of like other pathological related categories within various contexts. Next. So the kind of work that this idea then of looking at the scope and introducing this idea of a scope validity does is not replacing existing validity concepts, but in a way framing the problem. So it would, like, scope validity in this sense kind of frames and defines the conditions under which extrapolation should be assessed, right? So then it's not that external validity is total generalizability, but it has to be qualified for a given scope. Next. So in this sense, scope validity is the matching between the target in the setting of experimentation and the target in the setting of application. Next. And now we want to say, what is the advantage of thinking through such a theoretical framework when looking at precision psychiatry? And we're thinking of different things that you could do with that. So one aspect that I'm interested in are these meta-methodological questions. Because I'm interested in methodologies, I'm always interested in the how. So then the question is, well, how do you actually, how can you assess this matching And I think that that's an interesting question for philosophers of science to actually look at the methods that are applied and to see which scientific methods actually can evaluate the fit of approaches to an object of inquiry and how do they work. Next. And yeah, another thing that this question of the scope also addresses is to evaluate these promissory arguments about precision psychiatry and showing the interwovenness of epistemological and ethical issues. So then the question is, how should we think about the relationship of scope and precision when assessing psychiatric research? And now I would hand over to Katie.
All right. So yeah, we're not the first to notice that scope seems to be an important epistemic value. Kuhn himself wrote about this. What I asked to begin with are the characteristics of a good scientific theory. It should have broad scope. In particular, a theory's consequence should extend far beyond the particular observations, laws, or sub-theories it was initially designed to explain. And Kuhn gives 5 characteristics: accuracy, consistency, scope, simplicity, and fruitfulness, that are all standard criteria for evaluating the adequacy of a theory. What we want to suggest is that precision, which has become a really overarching epistemic value for contemporary medicine, argues for the opposite. It really favors a narrow scope. One thing we think that scope validity can help us do is that it can reframe the question of precision as a problem of scope validity and really help us reflect on whether broad or narrow scope are preferable, in what context each is preferable, if both are preferable, and then allow us to apply that more robust and careful set of epistemic values to the question of investment in precision psychiatry. So why do we think that there's this inverse relation between precision and broad scope? Well, for starters, as we've said, precision medicine rests on this promise that narrow explanatory victories in understanding biomarkers and understanding the mechanisms that they mark, and in matching those mechanisms with certain treatments, that those will generalize and broaden. So remember the picture I showed you of the little boy whose life was saved through precision medicine. There are probably 100, if that, patients in the world who share that particular disease, that particular genetic anomaly. So precision medicine, if it is going to be transformative, will need those discoveries to really scale up and have broader applicability.
Maybe 5 more minutes.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, we talk about this problem in philosophy of medicine as a problem of splitting of diagnostic categories, which the DSM already has long been accused of, as that book has, broadened from the first edition to the current 5th edition. So precision medicine takes splitting to a whole new scale, right? What we're talking about. And I think this is part of the rhetoric. Part of that promissory rhetoric is this idea that each of us really becomes our own patient. Sorry if you can hear that. My cat is attacking a cardboard box on the floor. Sorry if it's loud. Okay, so it's been argued by certain people. Francis Collins is the director of the National Institute of Health for a long time in this country. Collins argues that there's a false dichotomy that you have to have either precision medicine or population health. He says it's not a conflict. This is because I think he was seeing the emergence of this threat to the precision medicine paradigm coming from people who had precisely this sort of worry about how you get from broad scope to, from narrow scope to broad scope. And, I hope I've already made the case that at least in psychiatry, this really is a zero-sum game. I think that generalizes, but I just want to show you 2 more quotes from people thinking specifically about precision psychiatry. So one is by Bethany Teachman and her colleagues from a 2018 paper. There's been a steady drift towards prioritizing biomedically oriented research at the expense of more psychosocially oriented research over the past 20 years. This has hampered our ability to link biological processes to the human environment, social factors, and behaviors that shape and define mental illnesses and psychological disorders. In a similar argument, Luis Fernandez and his colleagues wrote, the NIMH has lost sight of its most fundamental mission, finding ways to ease the burden of mental illness for those affected by it today. So both of these critics are concerned that psychiatry's fundamental mission is not just about basic science or even translational discoveries, that its obligation is really towards treating the largest numbers of patients possible by whatever means necessary. In this paper, Teachman takes a really conciliatory approach. She says that the problem is that the NIMH is kind of ignoring psychologists and social workers in favor of neuroscientists, but that there could be a really productive working relationship between psychosocial researchers who could help the NIMH do this kind of work of figuring out what sort of precision psychiatry will have payoff down the road. This is exactly the kind of thing Lara was just talking about how thinking of challenges of scope and thinking about what our priorities are in relationship to scope might help address some of these concerns that people have. We want to end by just introducing another epistemic value, which is not something we talk about much, but is something I've been thinking about in my own work, which is the idea of generalism as an equal and opposite epistemic value to precision. And I just found, I just tripped upon this description from the University of British Columbia. And this is the description of the program in general internal medicine that their Department of Medicine offers. I just want to read their statement. General internal medicine is a subspecialty of internal medicine, which embraces the values of generalism, is aligned with population needs, and promotes the practitioner's ability to adapt their practice profile when population needs change. General internists are prepared to diagnose and manage patients with common and emergency internal medicine conditions and are able to do so when the individual has multiple conditions and with limited access to other subspecialists. General internists provide comprehensive care of the adult patient in an integrated fashion as opposed to an organ-centered or disease-centered approach. General internists advocate for their individual patients as well as for all patients within complex healthcare delivery systems by aiming to optimize and not maximize care, including prevention of other conditions. General internists recognize that the practice of medicine is tightly linked to the art and science of healthcare delivery, and by virtue of their pivotal role, are uniquely placed to engage in quality improvement, patient safety, and healthcare systems initiatives. So this is, I think, a very kind of simple description of what general medicine is. But I think the link between this kind of dedication to generalism in medicine and medical research is what the precision medicine turn attempts to sever or at least attenuate. So one way we can think on the most theoretical level about what's at stake with scope validity is the question of whether that's healthy or not. And here, whoever wrote this describes the importance of general internists mediating between the demands of public health and the demands of the individual patient. That can be leveled up also to the level of research, right? So there can be input from public health researchers mediated perhaps through how we think about the delivery of individual healthcare, and that can be used to shape our research priorities and the way we think about these difficult questions of diachronic justice. And I think generally the frustration that I've seen in my engagements with folks who are working on the ground in psychiatry comes in part from the feeling that that connection has been lost, and that the enthusiasm and excitement about fields like psychiatric genetics or psychiatric neuroscience really amounts to a kind of abandonment of them and their work. And so, when Incel came out and said that psychiatry just was clinical neuroscience or applied neuroscience, that was really, really painful for a lot of people who rely on the NIMH for their research, but also for clinicians who don't have a research life, but rely on that kind of translational work being done. And this is a moment where psychiatry generally from the patient side, the service user side, is really beginning to reimagine the nature of psychiatric illness as not purely biological, sometimes for some people not biological at all, simply a problem of the relationship between the individual and their environment, which isn't tolerant of the kind of psychic variation that they have. That kind of model, I think, is a real challenge to precision medicine. And I think philosophers need some way to talk about that conflict. So kind of from the 10,000 foot view, that's what we're hoping to do with scope validity. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We're now gonna take time for questions.
So if you have questions, I would just ask you to write it down in the chat. So I see, at least I see Miriam Salomon, who has raised her hand. So Miriam, you can ask your question, but then after I will ask you to write down in the chat that you have a question so I can see you.
Great, I really enjoyed this talk. And I particularly liked, maybe this was my interpretation, but you're finding that the opposite of an epistemic virtue can also be an epistemic virtue. I have been following a little bit the situation in Europe, and maybe Lara can speak to this, that while the NIH, told us what they were going to fund, and it was a fairly top-down thing, in Europe, they had a much more reflective process involving people at all levels of healthcare, including patients, to set priorities for research, and it was called Roma. So I wondered if you might speak to that.
Yeah. Yes, I think there is, it's really like a different kind, like how research is organized. I mean, like Europe is like much less, I guess, I mean, of course, like the Brexiteers would see that differently, but I would say Europe is not centralized. So like there are like, of course, a lot of different research organizations on the national level. And also the ERC is kind of like organized in a very different manner. I think like it's very interesting from the like psychiatric research point of view, because there's kind of like this interesting situation where I think American psychiatry and the DSM is like on the one hand quite influential as kind of a reference, but not on the legal basis, right? So you have kind of like this mixture between there's a song that says watching from the safe side, that I think kind of like depicts quite nicely the European view, right? That there's always it's of course like very much seen what has happened in the US and how the research organization functions there. But yes, the whole regulation process and research organization structure works very differently. That is true. And I do agree that, I mean, it's more complex because it's more participation and more negotiation, and it takes longer. But I'd also say that, I see a lot of virtues in that model as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add, Luc Fauché, who's here, knows like a lot about this, so he might have thoughts also. But my understanding is that Roma also just introduced patient participation and patient advocacy in a totally different way. So that from the beginning, they had service users involved in those discussions, and it was much more of a kind of democratically motivated decision-making process. And they also seemed to think a lot more about how collective decision-making was going to operate and kind of structure that in a more thoughtful way. RDoc had like public discussion boards where you could write stuff, which I would do occasionally. Like it was totally, I mean, it just felt like you were screaming into a void. And I think generally because of the provocative way in which RDoC was unrolled as being very much like against the clinical tradition. Even service users who themselves hate the clinical tradition were also, I think, really offended by that exclusion. So yeah, I think the entire tone of the projects was just really different, and that had a huge impact on the outcome.
We have a question from Benek Knox.
Sorry, there we go. Hi, fantastic talk, super interesting. Thank you so much. I'm sort of, I guess, playing devil's advocate with this question a little bit, because I'm sort of thinking, how would an advocate of the sort of precision medicine turn respond to this kind of critique? Which I guess I'm thinking would be sort of the practicality question, like, well, it would be great if we could come up with sorts of research projects that actually did translate into sort of broad scope and helping patient populations in a more broad sense. But like, if those things were easy to do or even possible to do, like, we would have been able to do them. And so sort of just by necessity, if we're going to make any sort of progress in, you know, working out biology of various mental disorders or whatever, like, the scope has to shrink in order to make the problems tractable at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, nice to see you, Bennett. Yeah, so right, that's certainly something that can be said and has been said to me. And I think there's a few different answers. The most important one, I think, is that this is not really a project, at least in the ethical side of this project. I think scope validity has a lot of promise in a lot of different directions, but the ethical side of this project is not intended to make scientific research better. The concern is about what kind of funding is being used to fund what kind of research, so that it may well be that there are very powerful discoveries about physiology, about neuroscience that will come out of research done with a narrow scope. The problem is when that research is being funded by public dollars that are earmarked for psychiatric research. I think it's important to think about what we mean by psychiatric research and what our expectations are for the impact of that research on patient outcomes. So I think it's absolutely right. And this, you know, goes back to Marianne's observation that we're looking at two different epistemic values, epistemic virtues, really, because narrow scope is, I would say, like the great engine of scientific discovery. Like, we're in no way trying to say that research with narrow scope should not be done. But the question is when and where and in what proportion, when what we're talking about is under the umbrella of medical research and not just of scientific discovery. Does that help? Lara, anything?
Yeah, I mean, you, Katie once came up with kind of like a slide with like rephrasing certain questions in terms of the scope question, and I think that's perhaps like one way to go forward, right? To say, well, if we talk about these questions of diachronic justice, then this also means that we kind of like say, okay, we do not have an answer. We do not say this is how you should go forward in every case, but it's about making explicit what is at stake, right? So if you hand in a research grant proposal for like a given model or a given drug or whatsoever, a research design, then, okay, it's kind of like, what do you think, like, what would be the scope for which this should actually match, and how would you kind of also evaluate this? I think it's about like turning these these questions into something that scientists should react to, also of course like with their scientific methods, right? But that's kind of like one of the ideas. And then it's of course kind of like a question that extends the scientific question, if you want to fund that, with what money, right? That's
yeah, we should find that slide. That was a good slide. I don't know where it went, but yeah, so I think that's really important. That's an important part of this, that we're thinking really about accountability and the kind of claims that people make about their research. I actually started thinking about this, I don't know, like over a decade ago, because my best friend is a a genetics researcher, and he's working on the genetics behind cell adhesion. So like really kind of local problem with narrow scope. But when people asked him what he worked on, he said cancer. And he said it because there was this potential downstream effect of this kind of research, which was looking at like how cell walls and adhesion were impacted by various kinds of chemotherapies. But it was really like a kind of dream he had for the destiny of this bench work that he was doing. And I think those dreams are really important, right? I mean, I think it's really crucial that we hear from scientists about what they think the applicability of their research is. But often those reflections of this on the scientist's part about applicability are kind of window dressing in a grant. Like it'll kind of just be there as a way to introduce, or it'll be there if you ask. So part of what we're advocating for in thinking about scope validity as being a measure that we sort of look out for and potentially require scientists to address is just to make that more explicit, so that that is less of a kind of rhetorical move and more of an actual part of the way that people present their research and ask for support.
All right, so the next question is from Awais Aftab.
Hello. Hi. Very sort of like thought-provoking, stimulating talk. It sort of like occurs to me that when we talk about precision and personalization in medicine, and I guess psychiatry generally, we tend to think about neurobiology and genetics and sort of brain circuitry. But there's also a different kind of personalization that has been going on for a very long time, and that's in the realm of psychotherapy, particularly sort of like of the more psychodynamic, psychoanalytic variety, where the therapist kind of like they really kind of hone in on the particular sorts of psychological conflicts and issues in that particular patient in front of them, and this is encapsulated by the idea of the psychodynamic or psychotherapeutic formulation, where you're formulating the problem in precise terms of the individual in front of you, in a sort of, you can say, like ideographic sort of approach. And so my question is that sort of personalization that has a very well respected history in the context of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, do you see that as being fundamentally different from the sort of personalization that happens in neurobiology? Or do you sort of like see it as being subject to the same sorts of problems and limitations? And a second and somewhat related point I wanted to make is that it's possible that we can have like very narrow models and precise models that look at certain individual phenomena, certain individual conditions, but the theory that guides these phenomena themselves could be quite broad in scope. So you could sort of like have like very precise models that may have like very narrow scope by themselves, though those models, but the underlying theory that guides the interpretation and development of those very precise things, that itself could be very broad. And for example, to this, in the case of the personalization that happens in psychotherapy, even though whatever, the profile of conflicts is being determined in each particular case, the theory that guides it, sort of like, central ideas of psychoanalysis, they themselves are quite broad. And you could sort of like imagine, let's say we develop some form of personalization that develops, that utilizes an array of biomarkers, such that, let's say you have 10 biomarkers and each person can be sort of like quantified, sort of like where they stand in terms of that, on the premise of those biomarkers. So everyone obviously would have a different sort of like biomarker portfolio, and you can sort of like say that different sort of like different sort of like profiles have sort of like different consequences for management. But the theory that guides and informs our understanding of those biomarkers itself would be quite broad. So I wanted to sort of like bring these two aspects to your attention, and curious to hear your thoughts.
Do you want to start, or should I?
You can start.
Okay, maybe I'll just start with the first one. Those are both wonderful questions, always. Thank you. Yeah, so I think that the rhetorical bait and switch around personalized medicine was really appalling. Jim Taberry's writing a book about this that I think will be really important and useful for us in thinking through exactly what happened. But I was trying to figure out what motivated the switch to precision, and I found a transcript from a meeting the National Research Council, in which someone really expressed the fear that people would think they were talking about what you were talking about. So they were like, we need to be sure that no one thinks what this new framework of medicine is about thinking about like who someone is as a person or something like that, because like that's not what we mean. And so they changed it to precision, I think, to differentiate it from that kind of personalized care. So there's been a few people who are working on precision medicine or making precisely this point, that if we wanted to personalize medicine, the way to do it would be to extend the attention to individual experience that is at the heart of psychotherapeutic care to other modes of care. So maybe we want to start looking more at personal history when a patient comes in with cancer, look at like the kind of support they have in their lives when we think about their kind of treatment. And there was a real fight to differentiate precision medicine from that sort of move. So yeah, I think that, there's certainly a case, and the case has been made, I think, by a lot of people that like we kind of move towards the wrong kind of personalization, and that the person is sort of missing. That's another kind of trope in this literature, that the person is missing from personalized medicine, because you have all the omics, starting with genomics and going up through proteomics and all the way up, but it doesn't kind of assemble itself back into a holistic individual. So yeah, I think that's like a very interesting language question.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, or both are very interesting. And I think like the contrast to psychotherapy, I mean, from a historical point of view, it's like, I think the debates were kind of like coming from completely different directions, right? Because the whole thing about like psychotherapy was like discussed in the past years very much like in contrast to the psychopharmaceuticals, right? That you cannot do randomized controlled trials in the same way with psychotherapy, and that is a problem for kind of legitimizing these as interventions in the same kind. But if you look at it from like this perspective that you made up with respect to the like, well, isn't that also a problem of a narrow scope? And on what level do you actually speak about that? So maybe an intervention can be like applied in a very like, I mean, we just heard that you have to be very careful with the language of personalized way, right? But right, it can be really fit to an individual, but you might nonetheless have some level where you have a broader granularity. So I think that's a very important observation. And again, I guess like for me the very interesting question is how are these levels dissected and also identified and matched in scientific practice? Because it's of course not that like we're not in a way saying, oh, the bad scientists, right? I mean, there are enough researchers who are like really frustrated about like how research funding is organized, because they say, well, we might have something that might be really working, but we just cannot find like the funding to actually assess what has gone wrong previously, because it's not directed towards kind of like the future and the discovery of a new mechanism. It's more kind of like finding out, okay, what have we and what didn't work, and where could we kind of like make this better? So I think it's also about really taking a closer look at a more diverse set of research practices that operate on these different levels. And thank you for bringing up these other examples.
Right. The next question will be from Kathryn Stinson.
Thanks. This is another question about the language being used. And it seems curious that what's being cast as basic science is the precision medicine side, because usually basic science and applied science are contrasted, where applied science is the one that's trying to like make a marketable product to bring to consumers. And so in this case, it's like either both are doing that, but they're just different kinds of products, or it's more the precision medicine side that's being called basic science. That's the one that's focused on making marketable products. And so it makes it difficult to make the point that like maybe less of the investment should be going towards the basic science, when that sounds like what you're for is, you know, more sort of marketing of products and less you know, pure science. So I'm wondering what to do about that, and like maybe here a splitting move of some kind is needed, or like a relabeling is needed. So I wonder what you think of that. And it also might be that just my understanding of how basic science is used in other contexts is just naive, and maybe it's always this way.
Yeah, I've thought about this, and I think you're right. There's probably still some work to be done. I suppose what we are interested in is precisely the slippage or the fuzziness between those two categories. So we're interested in the moments, you know, and this I think was illustrated so well by RDoC when RDoC was first introduced. Ken Schaffner and I were on an email thread with like a bunch of DSM folks working on the DSM-5. And I remember a personality researcher on that thread just said about RDoC, he was like, where is the psychopathology? Like, how does this have anything to do with psychopathology? And that was the feeling, was that psychopathology and thus like questions of clinical application had just been taken away. And it was really basic science in the sense of like just being genetics or just being neuroscience. And of course, I think that is not broadly true, in that most of the studies that are funded through RDoC are people who have kind of abstracted away from thinking in terms of diagnoses, but are still thinking like loosely in the space of psychiatric explanation, but not all of them. So, you know, there are projects funded under RDoC that could easily be funded under the National Science Foundation instead, or under, certainly under the NIH, but also just like outside of even the umbrella of health research. So I think the concern is that that boundary is not really being attended to. Not that, the worry is not that the NIMH is turning like entirely into a basic science research organization or something like that, but rather that part of what scope validity does is it allows people to talk very explicitly about the extent to which what they're doing has that kind of translational power. And I think, you know, the other thing that's been really interesting to me about precision medicine, I'm hoping someone will do some serious work on the economics of precision medicine, because I think it's complicated. So, you know, the products in terms of, you know, these kind of diagnostic assays or the use of GWAS to find these genes of low effect that then get applied to these cases. Certainly the treatments that can follow can be like multi-million-dollar treatments, and they have to be, because if your patient population is like 100 people, they have to be extremely expensive. So that's something that people have attended to a lot. But I think this question about how much of what goes under the umbrella of precision medicine actually makes money is not that obvious, especially in psychiatry. And I think what's happened in psychiatry is that other attempts to make money just really hit a wall, that you know, there just hadn't been any kind of real advances in psychopharmacological medication for so long that private research and public research both were kind of ready to clear the slate and try a new approach in the hope of kind of like breaking through into new sorts of therapies that would be efficacious. And so far that hasn't happened in psychiatry the way that it's happened in oncology and in immunology, where precision medicine really does have products to show. And my LM1 and I just completed a paper looking at that comparison between psychiatry and oncology to think about why that is and why there haven't been products in psychiatry. But I think that's, you know, another way that we can think about scope validity is and to think more concretely about what we mean by fulfilling the promise might be in terms of output. And that's something which in psychiatry is still just like a total pipe dream, as far as I can tell. And if people have examples of precision psychiatry paying off in terms of products, I'd be really interested to hear about those examples.
Yeah, I think that this question is really interesting to connect with Miriam Solomon's question, and so like how do and then this point of like what is psychiatric research, right? And I just 2 weeks ago I had a conversation with Kathryn Belsung, who was the animal scientist that I referred to in the talk, and so she runs like since 2 decades this animal science lab. And works with mouse models of depression. And she said for her, like one of the biggest problems is that the students have never seen psychiatric patients. And she thinks that this is a real problem because they kind of like come in the lab with this, like as Katie said, you have in the introduction something about depression, right? But it's kind of like a very, it's really bound to this idea of, okay, there might be some definition, some construct that you probably wouldn't have if you had some clinical training. And she thinks like that this actually hinders the kind of way in which the basic science that they are doing, because they're working with these mouse models, right? They're interested in biological mechanisms. So it's kind of like very much like in terms of when you do biomedical research and say you're interested in that, it's quite on the basic science. And of course, it's not comparable to theoretical physics, right? But it's kind of, I think what's interesting there is that, I guess if you have like this interest of making, creating something that is really translatable, then you have to think about this other domain where you want to translate it to as well. It's kind of like you cannot really separate it completely. And that's, I think, some realization that has, been much more prominently addressed in the last few years, because also with respect to like animal models, this whole idea of, that you do not have homogeneous diseases has been applied more and more into the research designs. So yeah, I guess that's another dimension of this question.
So we have another question from Sam Fellows.
Thank you for the talk. At one point, you said we don't want to return to the DSM. I suppose I was wondering if there's a danger that your argument might encourage or give support to a DSM type approach, or indeed maybe you've actually given a good argument of why the DSM isn't so bad. Insofar as in science, there's always that tension between wanting to describe something of a lot of accuracy and also to describe a particular instance of a lot of accuracy, but also making sure your theories or concepts cover lots of instances. And I guess that's true not just if we think about something like theoretical virtues in science, but also probably non-epistemic criteria for assessing science. So I suppose my question is, given your sort of argument you've outlined, what's wrong with at least seeing psychiatric diagnoses as being a nice way to have this slightly generalized notion that yes, it don't reflect specific individuals, but generality in itself can be accomplished in a useful way through psychiatric diagnoses. Any thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, I think what I meant was more, we wouldn't argue necessarily for a return to a status quo. I certainly feel like tossing out the DSM is just an impossibility and would be a terrible mistake, mostly because of just how embedded all of our systems are in its usage in the United States, at least. So in that way, I think the DSM is just like kind of the reality of certainly psychiatric practice. However, I will also say that I think it's kind of an exciting time for psychiatric taxonomy. So RDoc gets a lot of attention, but I've also been really interested in the development of HiTop, which is an alternative taxonomic instrument that I think Miriam has been thinking a lot about recently. Maybe we'll even get to hear about from her. I don't know what she's planning on speaking to this group about. But HiTop is a kind of response to RDoc by psychologists who say, look, instead of using the constructs of neuroscience and cognitive science, why don't we use the constructs of psychopathology? And in fact, the psychologist who I mentioned earlier, who was just kind of shocked by the lack of psychopathology in RDoC, is like one of the main architects of Tabb. So I think this is a moment where most people agree about the frustrations of the DSM for the research setting. And then there are also very long-standing established frustrations on the clinical side, which are different, which we didn't talk about, but are things like, you know, worries about bracket creep, worries about the fact that most psychiatrists and clinicians, and certainly internists, use the same, like, I think it's 6 diagnostic categories in rotation and ignore the rest of the manual, because what they're actually interested in is matching patients with certain kinds of insurance reimbursement, and they just don't care what diagnostic categories they're using. So I think there's, like, you know, both on the research side and on the clinical side, there's well-established frustrations with the manual. So, so it is a moment where I think there could be really interesting change, both in terms of how we think about classification of patients and in terms of how we think about classifying test samples in experimental settings. And so I think there's, like, a kind of interesting and nice emerging heterogeneity. You know, and this is a conception that Lara put forward a long time ago of thinking of diagnostic categories as what she called epistemic hubs, that they're really just centers for different sorts of researchers, clinicians, service users, everyone to just kind of come together and have some common vocabulary in exactly the way I think that you're thinking about. So, you know, I think categories will always play that kind of role. Will they always be the categories of the DSM? I don't know. I mean, the DSM is, you know, I think, like, rightfully, like, under a lot of pressure right now. I don't know. I work closely with the current head of the DSM revision task force. And so I see his frustrations because, you know, he just gets so much hate about the DSM. And, you know, he is very aware of all of its problems, like, probably more than anyone. But it also, like, it just is carrying the psychiatric profession on its shoulders at this point in the US and in much of the world. So you can't just toss it out. So I think these kind of new revisionary and to some degree, like, revolutionary ideas will be tried out. You know, I think Miriam's work here is also really important, where she's argued that in medicine, revolutions are really dangerous. They have huge repercussions for service users and for professionals. So, you know, unlike in science, there needs to be kind of a higher threshold of attention and care to when we transform the foundational practices of a medical science. And I think that's really, really important when we think about what change could look like. So all that to say, I guess my personal opinion is that there are serious problems, change is needed, but that change needs to be thoughtful and slow and somewhat conservative, just to support the provision of care for people. But Lara, I'm interested to hear what you think.
I think I have nothing to add. Yeah, no, I mean, I see that there are other questions, but I would agree. I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, on the one hand, you need some commonality, but then you also need, like, or there's automatically in medicine, I would say, always some taxonomic and explanatory pluralism, which is also, like, a good idea. But then the question is, how do these things relate back, right? And these are kind of like the switches where, like, the validity question really becomes a problem, but can also be addressed.
Right. So we have 2 more questions in the chat. So I would ask everybody to ask short questions and maybe to give short answers, so we have time to hear everybody. So the next question will be from Joanna F.
There's the unmute button. Hi, I'll make it quick. Thanks for a great talk. I'm terribly ignorant of a lot of these issues, so apologies. I think also my question might have been answered partially already. So coming back to this idea that when I was listening, I felt that for me, saying that precision medicine equals more biomedical research seems like a false equivalency. But that's probably because I was thinking more about personalized medicine, which then the distinction you kind of later made that clear, and how it relates to the funding issue and what is currently being funded more frequently. I was just wondering whether you could speculate on the reason for that. in the sense that maybe it seems like funding biomedical research in this precision medicine framework is the lower hanging fruit. That, as you gave the example of the little boy, I don't know what disorder he had, but I was thinking of the GLUT1 deficiency syndrome, where then you just have a ketogenic diet and people become seizure free. So you have kind of a monogenic or like a single gene mutation, and suddenly you have the perfect treatment for that particular individual. But of course, if you think about individualized treatment on the psychosocial level, then there are probably more factors that come into play into determining what subgroup might benefit from a specific treatment, whether it's, I don't know, CBT or drama therapy or group sessions or individual sessions. So that is just more work to get to that point. And therefore, given the pressure that a lot of researchers are under in all of the disciplines, as we all know, might that play a role, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm totally convinced by the answer you just gave to your own question. I think that's the right answer. You know, so that ad I showed for precision medicine, it had not just a zebra, but a rainbow zebra. And then it said, when you hear hoofbeats, think zebra, right? And this is referring to this old maxim from medical school that if you hear hoofbeats, you think horses. This is like obviously biased towards those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, but you shouldn't think it's the exotic thing, right? You want to first think it's like the heart attack or whatever and not get fancy because you're not Dr. House and that's not how medicine works. And so precision medicine wants to say, no, each of us is a zebra, like not just a zebra, we're like a rainbow zebra. And so we all need to be thought about at that granular level of complexity. And I think what you said is absolutely right, that in psychiatry, I just don't think that's right. I think like most of us are horses, but that is the gamble of precision psychiatry. The gamble is that more of us are zebras than we thought, and that'll pay off down the road. Yeah.
All right. So the last question will be from Daniel Mosley.
Hi, Katie. Hi, Lara. Thank you for the presentation. I'm going to keep my point pretty quick. I guess I think that one sort of small victory that the defenders of precision medicine might point to that I hadn't heard come up in the discussion so far would be to advances in pharmacogenomics. And so, you know, in the realm of pharmacy now, you know, you can read things like the Journal of Pharmacogenomics, where there's a lot of very technical discussions about how biomarkers are playing a role in improving the effectiveness of psychotropic medications. And so, you know, I could see the precision medicine defender saying, okay, you know, we haven't quite gotten to that future that we're looking for, where everyone can be sequenced and your entire like specific profile of everything you're susceptible to could be printed out for you. Yeah, we haven't quite gotten there yet, but that's the dream. We'll get rid of diseases. Everyone will have their own unique discussion, you know, capacity kind of, or potential for pathogens or whatever, you know, printed out, collated perfectly. But, you know, we haven't gotten there, but we are seeing some progress. So, you know, I just to give some credit to where there may be some credit due, you know, where, you know, people like Pat Sullivan, who's done a lot of work with big data on biomarkers for schizophrenia. Like in the past 3 or 4 years, I think that they'd say that their predictive models have become much, much more accurate because they have acquired enough data to have biomarkers that are more significant. So it's incremental progress. So, you know, anyway, just thought I'd throw that in the mix.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's again quite interesting to compare that with oncology, what Katie was already saying with respect to her paper with MyLM1, because I think there's some similarity also to the screening discussion in oncology there, right? So I guess, yes, there are definitive, like, again, promises. In some cases, it also works. But then in some cases, you also like have a lot of work going in on testing different biomarkers, and then a standard solution also works. So I think there's works better. So it's kind of like, I think a lot of discussion still going on about how much of this will actually like profit people on a public health level, right? So it's just like with the big screening programs, you see, it's good for some, but it also has some adverse effects on a population level. So I think it's an open question, but you're absolutely right. It's something to consider also in that framework. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree that I think pharmacogenomics is the most promising area. Whether that counts as precision psychiatry, I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. But again, I think that when we write this up, we need to be sure to like strike the right tone. I don't think either Lara or I are like Luddites or in any way anti basic or translational research. I think both of us have written, and a lot of our research has been more on like looking at the research side of things and the clinical side of things and being very interested in how explanation and discovery work in psychiatry. So really, I think what gets our ire up is this aspirational and really like fundamentally rhetorical quality of precision psychiatry that isn't attending to where it will be successful and where it won't. So an argument that says something like, okay, maybe we can't get to the point where we actually have like causal mechanisms for schizophrenia that are particularly useful. I mean, that seems more honest to me. However, we can be optimistic about pharmacogenetics helping us figure out who will respond best to the treatments that we have, or help us develop new treatments that certain subpopulations will respond to. That I think does hold real promise. And that's research that is important and should be funded. So, it's not, I think, for us an either or even like that we want to be or think that philosophers should be in a position of like ranking research or assessing what should be funded, but rather that we feel like there needs to be accountability in the way that those decisions are made and the way that researchers talk about their work to allow those decisions to be made with kind of full clarity and information.
All right, so unfortunately we are out of time, but let's thank our speakers of today, so Lara, Keuck, and Kathryn Tabb. And thank you to everyone here for the great questions. It was a very nice Q&A. So I will invite you to our next event. So next week is Awais Assad's talk entitled Disorder and the Legitimacy of Medicine. So we hope to see all of you next week. All right, so bye everybody, and see you next week.
Thank you, bye.